So this is going to be fun because we're having Tucker Goodrich back on the program. He's been someone that got a lot of great response from our audience on radio, our audience on YouTube, some of the podcast listeners really enjoy our discussion together. For those who didn't hear the first discussion, we talked about the foundations of his research in seed oils, how they're dangerous if consumed at the levels that we're tending to consume them in Western countries. We got into the idea of linoleic acid a little bit, polyunsaturated fatty acids, which is the category of acid that linoleic acid is under. And we got into just some foundations of what makes for obesity and chronic illnesses. And so we're just going to build on that discussion today with Tucker Goodrich, who's offered his time to us again to continue to journey and learn about these things. And so thanks for joining me, Tucker.
It's a pleasure to be back, David. Thank you for having me. Glad to hear I got a good response.
Yeah, and we've had you on a phone interview on radio. We've done the Zoom video podcast, and now we're going back to Zoom. And I want to get into some of these questions here that some folks asked on the last video we did, where they said, here's one, 85 Big Sky says, are PUFAs harmful? That's polyunsaturated fatty acids. Are they harmful because they oxidize easily before they are consumed, or are they harmful no matter?
That's a great question and a common misperception. They are harmful no matter because they oxidize easily. So whether you have a jar of corn oil sitting on the shelf, or you are using oil in cooking, or if you have consumed uncooked oil like a salad dressing, it is going to oxidize, whether it's on the shelf, in the frying pan, or in your body. And that's the root of the problem. Linoleic acid itself isn't harmful. It's in all foods. The problem is when you start consuming an excess amount of it, and then it starts breaking down into the toxic metabolites, right? I mean, that's why, we've all heard the word rancid, right? Rancid basically means the fat's gone bad and it's not fit for consumption. Unfortunately, polyunsaturated fatty acids are very susceptible to going rancid very quickly. And that's when they become a problem. So whether it's going rancid in your fat cells, or rancid in your shelf, or rancid in your frying pan, it's a problem.
And what is oxidation? What is oxidation, right? What is that?
Well, that's when the fat molecule, the point of a fat molecule for your body is that it can be oxidized, right? We use it for fuel. It's a storage form of energy, right? That's why we have fat cells. 95% of the energy that our body stores is in the form of fat. So oxidation is a good thing, right? We want to be able to burn fats for fuel. Obviously the reason people get too fat is because they're not burning fat for fuel. So it's a beneficial thing. An omega-6 or omega-3 fat will oxidize. It'll do what's called autooxidation, which means it's oxidizing itself, or it's oxidizing because of a catalyst in the body. Saturated fats don't do this because they are basically saturated with hydrogen, right? And unsaturated fat is missing a hydrogen atom in its structure. They're structured sort of like a chain with a bunch of carbons down the middle and a bunch of hydrogens along the sides. So if they're missing a hydrogen, there's an opportunity for an oxygen atom or molecule to get in there and react with the fat and break it down. So when the oxygen goes in and peroxidizes the fat, it breaks it down into subcomponents, and some of those subcomponents are toxic. So what we don't want is an excess amount of these fats in our bodies that are going to break down into toxins, clearly.
Yeah.
And that seems to be the root of a lot of our chronic diseases. You will go, and if you spend lots of time in the scientific literature, you will keep running across these two terms, lipid peroxidation and oxidative stress. And both of those are effectively at the roots of all the chronic diseases, including in obesity. And both of those are effectively the process of omega-6 fats breaking down into these toxic subcomponents like HNE, which 2-hydroxy or 4-hydroxy-2-nonenal, which I mentioned last time around, which is the best studied of these breakdown products. But there are others, and this. So anyway, that's what you want to avoid, is these toxins being produced in your body, or in your frying pan and then breathing them in.
And do those toxins are those toxins what cause the inflammation, the heat in the body?
Yes. I mean, inflammation is a beneficial, like most things, it's a beneficial process. When, if you get a cut, you get inflammation. It swells up and it's warm to the touch. And that's the process of your body healing itself, right? Inflammation is one of the first steps in healing. The problem is if something is constantly kicking off this inflammation process, it's what they call chronic inflammation or sterile inflammation, where you don't have an obvious injury like an infection. An infection will cause inflammation, or a wound, but you have these seed oils breaking down into these toxins that are causing damage throughout your body. That's what's causing chronic inflammation. And it's interesting on a molecular level. This is very similar to the process that happens when when you have an infection. Your body can't tell the outer casing of a bacteria from an oxidized seed oil, so it reacts as if you're being infected, right? And it has this, your body's willing to do damage to itself to clear an infection, which we see in COVID-19, right? Part of the damage to people in COVID-19 is from the body's attempt to clear out the viruses. And there's a lot of collateral damage, and like in a war, you're trying to kill the enemy, and sometimes you shoot people you don't mean to shoot. That's exactly what happens in your body under infection. And that can be a beneficial process in an infection, but if you clear the infection, the problem is these seed oils induce a state where it's all collateral damage, and you're basically inducing an autoimmune process in your body, where your body's attacking itself for no reason. And obviously that's not a good state.
How is that inflammation, how is it physically attacking the toxins or how does that?
So the white blood cells are there's several components of the immune system. One of the major ones is white blood cells, which we're all familiar with. Their job is to go eat pathogens, basically. They interpret the oxidized omega-6 fats as being a pathogen, right? So they go and attack it. That's why in atherosclerosis, for instance, you have white blood cells that are attacking the lining of the arterial walls. They are finding these broken down oxidized omega-6 fats and saying, oh, it's a bacteria. We have to clear it. And unfortunately, what they're not finding is a bacteria, but they're finding LDL, and they're finding cells that are damaged by this oxidative process. And the oxidation products themselves are toxic to the white blood cells, but the white blood cells are built to clear those out. So they're basically consuming all of this oxidized N6 fats until it kills them. And then they begin forming these plaques in your arteries, right? Mm-hmm. So that's a disease process in humans that's very well understood, although in the literature, most cardiologists don't really seem to realize that the whole process is a process of reacting to these oxidized omega-6 fats. That's, it's basically inducing an autoimmune state in your body.
Very interesting. Let's look at 33 YouTube user says, what happens when a person is in ketosis and consumes oils high in linoleic acid? Are they able to use it for energy, or is there problems with that?
Well, yeah, they are able to. It's another excellent question. They are able to use it for energy. There's some evidence that it's actually used preferentially as an energy source. What seems to be the problem, there are two problems there. There's a benefit, a relative benefit, and a couple of issues. The benefit is that when you're in ketosis, you're actually able to burn some of these oxidized N6 fragments as fuel. So instead of them going out into your body and doing damage, you can dispose of them in your mitochondria. This has been shown in a rodent model of a ketogenic diet. Rodents fed a ketogenic diet or fed a high polyunsaturated fat diet. It also, polyunsaturated fats are a preferential source for ketones. So there's a human study that showed that you get more ketones out of a polyunsaturated fat diet than you do out of a different fat diet.
Why?
Again, because it seems to be that they're used preferentially for a fuel source. That kind of gets into a whole issue about which fuel sources your body likes and doesn't like. So for instance, ethanol, alcohol, is used preferentially as a food source or as a fuel source. It's not done because it's a better fuel source. It's done because it's acutely toxic to your body. And one of the ways your body gets rid of it is by burning it for fuel, right?
Oh,
that's
like a
the
purge.
same It's a purge, right?
Like
You're burning
fire. Yeah, interesting.
Well, what I like to, back in the early days of the oil business, they used to burn off waste natural gas. You'd see these photographs with this pipe coming out of the side of the oil well with flame coming out of the top of it. And it was disposing of this natural gas, which at the time they didn't have any use for. So that's sort of what your body does in reaction to these toxic fuel sources, right? Same thing with glucose. When you have a big, if you eat a baked potato and your body gets this big bolus of glucose, too much glucose is toxic, right? Your body likes a certain amount and it likes that amount to stay in a huge range. So if you dump a big load of glucose in, your body reacts by trying to get rid of it as fast as it can. And one of the ways that it does it is by turning up your metabolism via your thyroid gland and trying to literally burn off the excess glucose that it can't turn into fat fast enough and it can't store into glycogen fast enough or sufficiently. So, it's interesting. Is your body doing that with polyunsaturated fats also? It's possible. There's some evidence that that's what's happening, but it's a little hard to say. What there isn't any evidence for is that having higher ketone levels because you're taking polyunsaturated fats is beneficial. The initial enthusiasm about high ketones in a ketogenic diet, there's not much evidence that a high ketone level per se is good for you, even in a condition like epilepsy where a ketogenic diet is used therapeutically. The interesting thing about that study in humans looking at a ketogenic diet with polyunsaturated fats was that all the people on the polyunsaturated fat diet got nauseous from it, right? Now, nausea is a symptom of acute toxicity. And this is something that was discovered a long time ago by Steve Phinney, who's now one of the chief medical officer for Virta Health, which is using a ketogenic diet to treat people. He did a study back, I think in 1994, looking at cyclists on a ketogenic diet. And the dietitian started off by trying to use mayonnaise as the fat source, which is, mostly high in soybean oil. That's what they're getting the fat from. And the cyclists all got nauseous from it. So they switched to another fat, which didn't make them nauseous. And Virta Health now recommends a low polyunsaturated fat diet because of Phinney's experience. And then along comes this study, 20 odd years later, confirming Phinney's experiment. If you feed people a ketogenic diet with lots of polyunsaturated fat, it makes them ill, literally, nauseous. So yeah, it's probably not a good idea. You don't generally want to eat things that make you nauseous. Your body's, smart. It's got billions of years of evolution behind it, not to take in toxins that are having an obvious negative effect on yourself, right? So, so you want to avoid these in a ketogenic diet. And there's unfortunately a medical ketogenic diet, which is what was used for a long time to treat epilepsy. And they advocated a lot of polyunsaturated fats. So there's a whole sort of corruption of the literature on ketogenic diets, because a lot of them were using these high polyunsaturated fat sources and reporting all sorts of negative effects from it. And there's really not much evidence that it's from the ketogenic diet per se. It's most likely, in my reading of the literature, from the effects of the polyunsaturated fats on the body.
And isn't it true that cold-blooded animals and cold water fish have a lot of PUFAs in their fat, right? That's part of
yes, that is the case. And the argument is that they sense so, well, let me go off on a slight tangent here, right? So when I got into this, I bought a 5-gallon tub of beef tallow, okay, from US Wellness was the name of the company, and it was great stuff. I would use it to deep fry. I made a recipe for French fries fried in tallow, which is how McDonald's used to do it. Oh my Lord, they're so good. You can't eat a lot of them. They fill you right up. But in order to get the tallow out of this 5-gallon bucket, I had to use a chisel and a hammer, right? It was the consistency of, excuse me, a bar of soap or a candle. So you couldn't just scoop it out. I literally had to use a chisel out of my toolbox to get the stuff out. Well, if you're a cow, that's fine, right? Because at body temperature, it's a liquid, beef tallow, right? If you're a fish in a cold ocean and you're full of saturated fat, you're going to turn into a bar of soap and sink to the bottom of the ocean, right? So one of the advantages to a cold-blooded creature in cold water is that a polyunsaturated or a monounsaturated fat has a much lower freeze point than a saturated fat does. So it allows you to survive in these cold waters, right?
But whales are mammals, so they're warm-blooded, so they can have saturated fat, right?
Bingo. Same for humans, right?
So we can still eat whales. That's the good news of this guy. I'm just joking.
Well, that gets into a whole other topic. Yeah. You probably shouldn't be eating whales unless you're in Iceland or Japan, where they're allowed to. Yeah. No. Just because whales are endangered and we're
I was saying that sarcastically with that intention.
Yeah.
But yeah. Do reptiles a lot of PUFAs too? Like if you eat gator, in reptile and snake. Not that that's a big thing that people eat, but I'm just curious.
I've never looked into that, honestly. I did see one study that used crocodile oil as one of the test fats, and I was wondering where on earth they were able to get that. But I mean, let's look at a reptile, right? What the first thing, I grew up in Connecticut in New England, which is pretty cold most of the year, and you don't see any reptiles. They go into hibernation. And then when it starts warming up, the first thing that they do is crawl very slowly out onto a rock to warm themselves up. So alligators only live where it's warm, right? So they don't need to worry about how saturated their fat is, because it's going to be room temperature or body temperature most of the time, human body temperature. It's going to be above the point where it changes from a solid to a liquid. So that's an interesting question. I haven't looked into that just because it's kind of off topic.
Yeah. I wonder about well, it may be on topic if they're going to get us to eat insects. They want us to eat insects to save the animals. So with the carbon.
Yeah, that's another,
Is that a lot of linoleic acid there? Is that like having cashews in terms of linoleic acid bombs? I don't know.
That's another thing I haven't really looked at, honestly. I know there were like bumblebees make heat so they can fly around when it gets too cold. I don't know if that's because of the fats in their body. Bugs, the only conversation I've had about bugs, there was one fellow who is growing mealworms as his sort of source of protein. And I reminded him that if he was, the fatty acid composition of the mealworms is going to depend on what you're feeding him. So if you're feeding him lots of corn, they're probably, the linoleic acid concentrates up the food chain. It's just like chickens, right? Pasture chickens are going to eat a lot of bugs, and they're going to eat a lot of plants as opposed to being fed grain, and they're going to have a much healthier fatty acid composition. So yeah, I mean, if you want to go eat bugs and they're natural bugs, I'd say knock yourself out.
Yeah.
There are some cultures like in Mexico and in Asia, bugs are a treat. My daughter was offered silkworms in deep fried silkworms when she was in Korea, and it's apparently a delicacy and a common street food over there. She didn't care for them, but that doesn't mean that they might not be tasty to somebody who is used to eating them.
Another YouTube listener on our channel says, or viewer says, what happens when humans lose weight and have to burn linoleic acid that has been stored up in the fat? Does it make losing weight difficult?
That's a great question. And nobody's really looked at that. It may make losing weight difficult, but on the other hand, you don't really have any alternative because there's no other way to get rid of it. So I wouldn't go on a low N6 diet just because you're worried about the N6 coming out of your fat cells, because the N6 that's in your fat cells is breaking down and is causing that autoimmune response from your white blood cells that I mentioned before, right? That's kind of a common motif in most of these chronic diseases, is that as these fats are breaking down, even when they're in storage, they're causing your body to attack those cells, and inflamed fat cells is a common symptom of, modern obesity, especially in visceral fat cells, which is considered to be the most harmful form of fat. So that may be an issue, but it's all the more reason to fix your diet and get rid of it as fast as possible.
And so that leads me to my question. What is the fastest, healthiest way to get those PUFAs out of your body, because it takes a few years, and a lot of people have them. And if you're living in a westernized type diet country, you probably have some of them accumulating in you. And obviously there's a natural amount of PUFA that's okay. We understand that. I like saying, let's have a PUFA free nation, but that's not technically correct. And we understand that, but it just sounds so good. But because just PUFA just rolls off the tongue when you're thinking.
Yeah.
But what what do you think is the healthiest way of dealing with weight loss? Even if you don't have a tremendous amount of weight, we can talk about maybe there's a difference for people who have a lot of weight they want to lose versus a little bit. And the fastest or healthiest, most efficient way that you've seen in studying the literature. Obviously, you have carnivore, you've got keto, you got low carb. You got the low fat people, you got the repeat folks, and a lot of the repeat folks make some of the same arguments that you make about the dangers of omega-6. But they also say, hey, no, keto long-term, that's going to raise your cortisol. It's not something you want to stay in. It's too stressful for the body to stay in long-term. So how do you look at the lay of the land there with weight?
Well, that was a full question, David. So yeah, the Ray Peat thing, Ray Peat's a really interesting guy. I'd call him a bit of a genius, but that's kind of a longer topic. The most effective way, as in any problem that you have, the most effective thing is, they say, the first rule of holes, stop digging. If you're in a hole, stop digging. So the first thing you want to do is get rid of sources of excess polyunsaturated fatty acids in your diet. So that means, seed oils, anything that's going to contain seed oils. And this is basically the common thread, in my view, in a lot of these different dietary prescriptions. Even in a low-fat vegan diet, the first thing that they tell you to do is cut out these high-fat oil sources, right? And we've seen in some studies recently that can be really effective, or one study by Kevin Hall recently, that can be a really effective weight loss avenue. And I would argue that it's just because they're cutting back on the omega-6 fats. That's why they're losing their weight. Doesn't have anything to do with the fact that they're not eating animals. So you want to get rid of those high omega-6 fat sources. That's going to be, salad dressings, olive oil that you think may be, or avocado oil that you're not completely convinced that it's pure. animals that are fed high amounts of omega-6 containing grains like pigs and chickens, chicken eggs, conventional chicken eggs that aren't pastured.
What about farm-raised fish that's popular, like tilapia, salmon, stuff like that? Is that sneaky linoleic acid sources?
It is. I've only seen, there is a study where they fed soybean meal to salmon and then the salmon to mice, and the mice got sick from being fed salmon that was fed soybean. So that's definitely an issue. I don't know about, there are different fish have different fatty acid balances. I haven't really looked at tilapia or some of the other farmed ones, but in general, well, let me say, if you're eating farmed salmon, you're probably better off than eating farmed chicken or farmed pig, because it's still going to have some DHA, which is a beneficial omega-3 fatty acid.
Does that mop up some of the omega-6 content in those fish or no?
It doesn't mop it up, but it offsets it to some degree, especially in terms of obesity. It seems to offset it. But, if you're looking for so I wouldn't categorically say don't eat farmed fish, but wild fish, if you can get it, is definitely going to be a better source because it's going to have a lower omega-6 fatty acid balance because fish obviously don't eat seeds or seed oils in their natural environment. And the same thing goes for farm trout or whatever else. I try and avoid those in general, but once in a while I'll, if you go to a sushi restaurant, I think that's a great thing to do. And most of the salmon in sushi restaurants is farmed salmon, and I eat it and enjoy it.
What about shellfish and octopus and things like that? Crab.
Shellfish are probably one of the healthiest foods that you can eat. They're very clean. They basically are filters of seawater, which is generally very clean. They're very high in micronutrients and minerals. Octopus also, I'm not aware that anybody farms octopus. I love octopus. Again, it's kind of got an odd texture, but once, if you can get over that, it's delicious. I've never really looked at the health benefits of eating octopus, but it's plain delicious. So, and, clams and oysters, which are farmed fish, but they don't really feed them anything. They just put them in an area and then they filter the seawater that's coming over for whatever foods are in the seawater. So that's actually probably one of the best food sources you can get is shellfish.
Conchs and stuff.
Yeah. Conchs. I don't think I've ever had conch in my life, but in New England.
Hey, we've got foodies in this audience. I'm trying to give people some hope here.
Now, escargot's a question. I don't know if they're farmed or not, but how often does anybody eat escargot?
Yeah.
It's actually interesting. There was this one of the first groups that had major dental problems was this Paleolithic hunter-gatherer group in northern Africa. And they had absolutely horrible teeth, and they lived mainly on a diet of snails and acorns. So I would say strongly, don't do that. Don't live on a diet of snails and acorns. But yeah, escargot, if once in a while, knock yourself out, especially with butter and garlic. Delicious.
So anyways, back to where I kind of detour you, but it's fun because we get to think of things off topic that are kind of related, because I'm trying to give people hope for what they can eat and still maximize their weight loss journey or healing journey. Because if you don't need to lose weight, you still got probably decades of PUFA in your body that have accumulated.
Right. So the first thing you want to do is fix your diet and get the nasty foods out of it. PUFA being omega-6 PUFA being number one in my book. The next thing you want to do is how are you going to get rid of what you have, right? Weight loss and exercise is a really big topic. The short version is that exercise is a lousy way to promote weight loss. But once you fix your diet and you do start losing weight, exercise is a great adjunct, but you want to be exercising in a way that is promoting maximum fat oxidation, right? How are you going to be burning the most of this excess fat that you've got? And there are two avenues that you're going to take to do that. The first is most people, when they fix their diet, they immediately find that they have more energy and they feel like exercising, right? Being obese makes you, for a variety of reasons that we won't go into right at this moment, makes you want to not exercise, right? So you can't blame these overweight people who have a hard time exercising, because it's hard when you're overweight to exercise, and you've got these chemical signals in your body that are telling you not to exercise, right? So once you fix that and you start getting some more energy, a lot of people say, I've got all this energy, what am I going to do with myself? I'm going to start going to the gym. That's awesome. Resistance exercise, weightlifting, will help you build up muscle mass, which will help your body. Muscle mass is prefers to use fats as a fuel source. So that's a great way to start burning off this excess fat that you've got on your body. Aerobic exercise is another great way. Again, this is something that prefers to use fat, and you don't need to run. I'm a runner. Running's great. I ride bikes too. That's great. But if you're overweight, you're at a increased risk of injury from running, right? You're carrying a lot of extra weight on your body. There's a Dr. Mark Cucuzella, who was an Air Force, I think it was a lieutenant colonel or colonel. My apologies to Dr. Mark if I got that wrong. And at one point, he was running the Air Force Running Injury Prevention Program, which meant he basically had 400,000 patients, right, trying to figure out why so many of them were getting injured running. And the number one reason was because they were overweight. So if you're overweight and you're losing weight, don't run. Start walking, right? Walking's awesome exercise. One of the most successful weight loss stories I'm aware of is a woman who went on a ketogenic diet and then started walking, and she would do 40-mile walks around Seattle. And she went from being very overweight and epileptic to asymptomatic in her epilepsy and thin as a rail in a couple of years. So you can have a super successful weight loss program without having to go beat yourself up. And I would argue the number one thing you do in a successful weight loss program is don't beat yourself up, because you want to enjoy the exercise. You want to go out and do the exercise. If you hate it, then you're not going to do it. And I say this as somebody, I do a lot of exercise and I hate doing exercise. I do this stuff because I love doing it. And the fact that it has health benefits is just like an added bonus in my book. But you want to start opening up that fat burning channel and promoting restructuring your body so that you're relying on fat as a fuel. You want to go from being a carbohydrate, a sugar burner, to being a fat burner, and it will make you feel better. It will give you more energy, and it's better for you.
So what about people that say, I can't train as well when I'm doing ketosis. I just don't have the energy. When I introduce the carbs, it allows me to train and build muscle faster and recover faster. But then I was thinking what you were saying, that the body, you said muscle prefers fat for fuel. So how can those things be true at the same time? Maybe.
Well, so let's start by looking at humans are predators, basically, right? I mean, that's what differentiates a person from a gorilla. A human's a predator. We're the apex predator on the planet, right? So we would have to hunt regularly. If you hunt and you miss a meal, you're running on fat for fuel, for your primary fuel source, because that's what your body stores. 95, 98 maybe percent of the energy stored in your body is from fat. 2% or 5%, depending on how lean you are, is stored as glucose and glycogen. Now, your body's not stupid. It didn't evolve this way so that you would rely on carbohydrates for fuel and not be able to go on the next hunt, right? You have to go. Every single one of us is here today because we are descended from successful hunters, right? That's what makes humans human. So ketogenic athletes, generally what they do is they supplement with a tiny amount of glucose, like a fourth of what a typical high carb athlete would use as a supplement. This has several benefits in the course of actually exercising. One of which is that if you eat too much glucose during, I'm thinking specifically about ultra runners here who go out and do long exercises, right? If you're going to run a 5K, you don't need to eat anything. You're not going far enough. Or if you're going on a 5-mile hike, you don't need any food. You don't need any water. You just, that's well within your capability. But these more extreme situations, if you eat too much glucose, you can first you cause nausea, you'll get sick and you'll wind up throwing up on the side of the trail. Well, that's not good for your performance if you're racing. And some guys actually get an insulin spike and can't access fat and they bonk, right? This is what, I don't have, are you familiar with the term bonking? Is this just like an athlete geek term?
Is that like hitting the wall or different?
Hitting the wall. Yes. So hitting the wall is when your body runs out of fat, runs out of energy to burn, right? This happens to marathon runners typically around the mile 20. And what this means is that you are relying on glucose for fuel. You are unable to access enough fat for fuel, and you've just run the tank dry, the glucose tank dry. Now, that's a teeny little tank. It's only 2 to 5% of your energy stores, right? So you're not training right if you're running your tank dry. The first thing that professional athletes who switch from a high carb to a ketogenic low carb diet say is, wow, I don't bonk anymore. And for us average folks, boy, I remember the first time I ran a half marathon, I bonked about 11 miles into it, which tells you how out of shape I was. My body wasn't, and this is one of the hallmarks of somebody who's got metabolic syndrome is they're not able to generate energy from fuel and they're not able to access fat, right? And this is a problem. This is something that we need to fix. It means your engine's broken. So yeah, you can, if you need a little bit, like these athletes, if you need a little bit of carbohydrates, if you're really going to go out and do some really glycolytic activity, a little bit of glucose is going to be fine. You don't need to be totally ketogenic. Your body can, your body produces ketones when you're exercising. It's one of the best ways to get into ketosis, right? Your body is designed to use both fuels, ketones and glucose simultaneously during exercise. So that's
does the average American who's doing mild exercise a day but eating the standard American diet, are they still burning ketones too or no? Because of the amount of carbs the average American diet is usually consuming. Let's say they're doing brisk walking, they're going to the gym once or twice a week.
They're probably not seeing much in the way of ketones.
That's not good. You're saying you need to get ketones out, right? To be using them, right?
Well, all that ketone burning indicates is that you're using fat for fuel, right? That's it. When you don't have any carbohydrates in your body, I mean, you always have a little, but when you're not consuming them regularly, your body is going to switch over to fat for fuel, which is what it's supposed to do. And it's going to start producing ketones because ketones replace glucose as a fuel source for tissues that are dependent on glucose, like your brain, right? So if you are fat adapted, you can get by with a lot less glucose in your body than somebody who's not fat adapted. That's why, hypoglycemia is where your glucose is too low and it causes basically your brain to shut down because it's out of gas, right? But if you're fat adapted, you can get by with far lower glucose levels. And there's a study in humans where they got glucose levels down to levels that would leave an average person comatose by injecting insulin because these people were fat adapted and they were able to use ketones as an alternative fuel source. There's a scientist, Dom D'Agostino, who studies ketogenic diets for the Navy, and he did something you definitely do not want to do at home. He discussed in a couple of podcasts, and he was able to get his blood glucose level down to undetectable and did not lose consciousness or did not have any negative effects from running entirely on ketones. You're never going to do that, right? Nobody should do that. He probably shouldn't have done that. That was kind of crazy, but it was a really interesting experiment. So Yeah, you want, my view on ketogenesis is that you want to be intermittently, at least intermittently into ketosis.
How often
And
is intermittent for you, for for an average person?
well, think about it. You know, if you're on kind of a lowish carb diet, you're probably going to be into ketosis every morning when you wake up,
And what's the lowest
right?
carb diet there, for listeners?
Say, 20% of your calories is carbohydrates.
Mm-hmm.
Generally, what I do is I get up in the morning and I'll have some coffee with some milk or some cream in it. And then I'll go out and do whatever exercise I'm doing for the day. Well, that's immediately going to kick me into ketosis, right? Especially if I'm going out for a run or, if you're doing what they call slow burn weightlifting, where you're trying to take it easy, you're going to be relying on fat and you're going to be using ketones for fuel. I don't think it's necessary to be always in ketosis. I don't think there's any benefit to it. I also don't know that there's any harm to it. We can get to the Ray Peat critique on that, because that's one of his core points. Ultimately, if you're not eating any carbohydrates, at some point your body is going to be breaking down protein for glucose. Your body's always breaking down some protein for glucose. So that's not an abnormal thing. It's just, if you kick it up to a level where your body finds it stressful, that's probably not optimal. And that's one of the arguments that some people use. There's a fellow, Paul Jaminet, who wrote the Perfect Health Diet, which was one of the most scientific diet programs I've ever seen. And his point was, you want to eat some glucose because it lowers your body's requirement on breaking down protein. Your body has a protein store, despite what some scientists say. It's your muscle, right? It's the emergency store. So you don't want to, muscle's healthy. Having muscle mass is healthy. You don't want to put yourself into a situation where you're breaking down too much muscle for fuel, right?
That's
not beneficial.
What is that level where you're starting to break down muscle for
Well,
fuel?
so there was an ultra runner. I can't remember his name right now, or his handle. He tried doing a ketogenic diet a number of years ago. His handle online is Fellrunner, FELLRUNNER. And he tried doing a ketogenic diet, but he started off with the medical ketogenic diet that was used to treat people with epilepsy. Okay. Let me start by saying that I think the medical ketogenic diet that was used to treat epilepsy was very unhealthful, and it's largely, they agree, because they've largely abandoned it for treating epilepsy. They're now using a much more natural diet called the modified Atkins diet. So the first thing, so they had the four main parts of this treatment were very low carbohydrate. I think it was 4 parts: very low carbohydrate, very high fat, very low protein, and very low water intake. I don't know what the point of the water intake thing was. And so basically it was, a starvation level diet. And if you put children on this diet, which they often did, they would fail to grow, which is what you would expect of a child put on a starvation level diet. So this gentleman, Fellrunner, who was running and running and running, put himself on this starvation level diet and basically went into protein deficiency. And, if you read his account of this and then go read a description of what protein deficiency is, it's obvious that that's exactly what happened to him. So, that's a harmful ketogenic diet, not because ketogenic diet per se is bad, but because it was badly constructed. So if you look at the scientific literature, there's no evidence whatsoever that a high protein intake on a ketogenic diet is a problem, right? And they've done it in the experiments up to 30% protein. So this fellow was on a 9% protein diet, right? The average human protein intake is 12 to 15%. And people can consume up to 30%. The carnivores typically are 30+%. And there's no indication that a high protein intake is bad, assuming you're getting adequate sources of calories like fat and carbohydrates at the same time. One of the things that I did early on when I fixed my diet and didn't really understand what I was doing was go on a high protein, low fat, low carbohydrate diet. And you get into something that's called rabbit starvation, where your body panics at eating too much protein. And, I found myself craving fat, this mad, insane craving for fat. And I drove home from work and stopped at the supermarket and got a jar of coconut oil, because at the time I thought that was the healthiest fat, and went home and was eating coconut oil out of a jar with a tablespoon. Don't do that. Happened to me again. And at that point I realized, okay, buddy, you need to be eating some fat on a regular basis here as part of your diet, or you're going to be miserable. That's a mad craving. I mean, it was literally all I could think about was eating fat. It was bizarre. So you want to get enough. If you're on a ketogenic diet, you want to make sure you're getting enough protein, and a little bit of carbohydrates in and out is normal. That's what humans evolved for.
What's the difference between going in and out of intermittent ketosis versus yo-yo diet? Now, I know yo-yo means you could binge on Snickers, but I'm saying like the healthy version. Like, a
yo-yo diet is when you're going from a weight loss diet to a weight gain diet, right?
Okay.
That's just a bad idea.
But if you eat a giant bowl of rice once a week, is that a type of mini yo-yo where you're spiking your glucose and then you're going back down into low carb? And is that healthy, or is it good to do that for people?
My view of carbohydrates is that it's kind of plan B for human nutrition, right? We clearly evolved eating a certain amount of carbohydrates in our diet. I mean, you go back and you look at primates, chimpanzees in Africa where we evolved, will use tools to dig up tubers and eat those. Humans, like the Hadza hunter-gatherers in Africa, do the same thing. Tubers are a regular source of energy for them. So some level of carbohydrates is something we were well evolved to handle, right? I mean, so I don't think I think the problem with a high carbohydrate diet happens when you start not getting enough animal protein and animal fats in your diet, right? I mean, there's lots of research done in Africa looking at malnourished children, where a high carbohydrate diet produces stunting and cognitive defects. They're not able to develop their brain properly, and it's cured by adding meat into the diet, right?
But you look at the addition of the fruits, it's the lack of the other stuff.
That's right. So if you're getting, and typically hunter-gatherers will eat from 15 to 35% of their calories from animal sources of food. So I would say if you're, the Hadza are probably at the low end of that. They're not getting enough animal foods, and that's indicated by the fact that they tend to be short and very skinny. So, you want to be somewhere north of 15%. A lot of that's going to depend on how active you are. And, obviously if your goal in life is to be a weightlifter, you're going to be eating a lot more protein because you want to build up muscle, which is made primarily of protein. But if you're an average person, you don't need to, I think a carnivore diet seems to be healthy. I mean, there are people who've apparently been eating them for decades, but I don't think it's necessary for most people to go to that extreme to be healthy.
Do you think it could be the optimal way, even though most people don't want to eat that way because it's just so social and anti-pleasure to just eat meat only and organ meats for the rest of your life?
Well, I guess that sort of depends on who you hang out with, the social aspect. But I just don't think, look, the people I would recommend that for are people who have really severe autoimmune or digestive issues, just because it's really getting rid of everything else, right? It's an elimination diet at that point. But if you're generally healthy, it's just not necessary. I don't know that there's really any benefit to it. I don't know. never seen any evidence that there's harm from it. Assuming there's one big caveat there, vitamin C, right? I mean, there's people who don't understand this stuff will say, oh, if you go on a carnivore diet, you're going to get scurvy because you're not getting any vitamin C. Well, animal tissue contains vitamin C, and it was shown 90 plus years ago that you will not get scurvy on a carnivore diet, right? So that's just an
And 100
ignorant.
grams of calf liver has as much vitamin C as 100 grams of grapefruit, you know?
Yeah, and they also, it seems to, lower your requirements for vitamin C, which is kind of off topic, but an interesting point. However, if you store meat, the vitamin C degrades over time, right? That's why people on ships used to get scurvy. It was not because they weren't eating limes or citrus. It was because the beef or the pork that they salted and stored for a couple of months, the vitamin C degraded to the point where they couldn't access it. And that's why they were getting scurvy. So if you are on a fresh meat diet, as I said, this was shown, in a scientific demonstration in humans almost 100 years ago, you're not going to get scurvy. So
if you want to maximize anti-aging effects and so forth, I wonder, I'm just talking out loud here, that maybe the carnivore way is the optimal way. Again, if you can stomach the fact of not having those pleasure foods that are in other categories, but you think about the oxalates in plants, the lectins in plants, if you're eating lots of fruit, you're going to have potential problems with tooth decay, maybe, right? And you're hitting your liver. I know it's not as bad as alcohol. I think that's overblown,
it's certainly possible that it's optimal.
Yeah.
That remains to be shown.
Obviously it's just a hypothesis, but I just think that perhaps maybe.
I mean, there's
those anti-nutrients in your body all the time, but you're getting plenty of protein and plenty of glucose from a little bit of honey, or there's glucose, there's carbs in crab legs, and there's carbs in oysters, so there's ways to get your carbs and the bio.
Well, you don't. I mean, there's only one thing that's totally clear in the nutritional scientific literature, and that's that you don't need to eat carbs, right? Period. There's just no dietary requirement for carbs. Your body can make it if it's not getting it from the diet. So that's, I mean, whether or not that's optimal, I don't know. If we start looking at long-lived populations and their meat intake, I mean, probably, historically the longest lived large population on Earth are the Japanese. They were renowned even couple centuries ago for being very long-lived. For 800 or 1,200 years, it was illegal to eat meat in Japan. That's kind of surprising. And, one can argue that the Japanese, who, in terms of stature, tend to be smaller than non-Japanese, were smaller because they weren't getting enough meat in their diet. Since World War II, they've made a huge effort in increasing the amount of meat in their diet, and their longevity has gone up. So I definitely think, there's one really fascinating Japanese study. You hear these knuckleheads who, sorry to be pejorative, but I think they qualify, who promote the blue zones, and their favorite case study in the blue zones are the Okinawans, which is now was for a long time not part of Japan, but has been part of Japan for the last 100 years or so. And they were like, oh, the Okinawans eat this near vegan diet, and they're the longest lived population on the planet. Okay, well, they didn't eat a near vegan diet. They ate more meat than everybody in the rest of Japan did. They were more long lived than the rest of Japan was. So one could argue that more meat gives you higher longevity, which I would. Since probably the 70s or whatever, Okinawan longevity has gone down because they've adopted an American diet, thanks to the U.S. Army base over there. So that's been a bit of a disaster. And the rest of Japan, meat consumption went up because the Japanese came to a conclusion that part of the reason they got beat in World War II was because, Americans are eating beef by the truckload and the Japanese weren't. So there's a hilarious comment by the head of McDonald's in Japan saying, if we eat hamburgers for 1,000 years, we'll become blonde and conquer the world. I presume he was tongue in cheek, but the Japanese longevity has gone up as their meat consumption has gone up dramatically. So, but again, the Japanese, after World War II, once their diet kind of normalized, they were eating 84% carbs, and now they're eating about 55% carbs, and their fat and meat intake has gone up a lot, and their longevity has gone up. So, yeah, there's it's a spectrum. I mean, I think they were definitely undernourished when they were eating 85 or 84% carbs and just relying on fish and a little bit of meat for the rest of their diet. And they're probably much better off now, and they're probably taller now. Same thing happened in China. The Chinese, when they were under communism, were quite short in stature. And then as their diet has improved over the last few decades, they've gotten taller. Fortunately, they've added a lot of seed oils in, and they're also now obese and diabetic too. But so I don't think, if you've got some real digestive problems, there have been some, miraculous antidotes of people curing Crohn's disease by going on a carnivore diet. And there's a clinic in Eastern Europe. Can't remember the name of the doctor who runs that, that focuses on a carnivore diet as their therapy for a variety of different conditions. So
at the same time, I've heard people with Crohn's disease say that they can't digest the red meat when it's like rare. Have you heard of that?
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe when it's rare. I mean, there was a guy who had a intestinal tract transplant. I can't remember his name, but the handle he went by online was Wolverine. So through a rather egregious case of medical malpractice, he had to have his entire intestinal tract south of his stomach and north of his anus removed. So what that meant was that he would eat, and he had like 2 feet maybe of small intestine to absorb the nutrients. And then it went out into a bag, right? So this guy could eat and see how well things were digested, because he wasn't looking at poop. He was looking at, it's like whenever you get sick and you throw stuff up, you can usually see what it was, right? Well, this guy had exactly that. He would chew it, it would go down into his stomach, and then it would go out into this bag. And what he found was that meat just disappeared. Meat was entirely digested in his 2 feet of small intestine. That acid in the stomach is there to break down meat, and all that would come out was vegetable matter that was indigestible, and is supposed to go down into your colon where it gets fermented into fats. But of course, he didn't have a colon, so it couldn't. So,
see, to me, the case for longevity with carnivore heavy lifestyle is just that. You think about running a car, and you're running a car and you break the car down eventually from wear and tear. And if you're running your body on stuff that's just shooting out tons of vegetable matter it doesn't need, you're just inefficiently running fuel through it, which is
well. But don't forget. I mean, it's we're breaking it down into these very beneficial fats. Like there's one of the fats is butyric acid, which is a precursor to butyrate, which is the ketone, right? So you're getting, from vegetables. That's when your body is, undigestible starch goes down into your colon and it gets fermented into fats. It's beneficial fats. So yeah, it's a good argument, but
that reminds me.
But one other point that I wanted to make though along those lines is, there's an oxidative stress model of aging where they say that that's why we age, is because we have oxidative stress and all these toxins get generated and it causes all this damage to the molecules in your body. And that's pretty compelling. So they did this study looking at this green tea extract, right, as an beneficial antioxidant. But to test it, they wanted to get people into a state where they didn't have any other beneficial quote unquote antioxidants from plants. They only wanted them to have this green tea extract. So they put these people on a no plant diet and tested their antioxidant status. And they were way better off with no plants in their diet. Unfortunately for them, the green tea extract had no effect whatsoever. So at the end of the study, they say, so basically, this was a test of the beneficial effect of plants on antioxidant status, and the people who ate no plants were better off. So, there's a really good argument to be made for a carnivore diet.
And I was also thinking about the vitamin C thing. The molecule for vitamin C is similar to the sugar molecule.
Yeah, that's been an argument that's gone around for a long time. I don't know.
No, it's not true.
I honestly haven't put enough effort.
Because I was just thinking about if that's true, that makes sense that, you need a lot more vitamin C when you're eating a lot of sugar because, sugar is a fuel for cancer when it's fermented and you want to, and your fermented cancer cells are trying to grab this sugar. And maybe that's why you need vitamin C to compete with that I don't know. I was just thinking
saying sugar's a fuel for cancer is a bit of an overstatement. I mean, cancer cells use, Seafried, who's done a lot of the metabolic research recently into cancer. It's not just glucose, it's also glutamate, which is an amino acid, which is a protein that they use. And there are types of cancers that use fat for fuel. In fact, there are a couple of cancers that seem to do better on a ketogenic diet. So I wouldn't go, cancer's a super complicated disease. Yeah. I think the only safe thing you can say about cancer is that whatever general statement you make about cancer is going to be wrong for a lot of different types of cancers. Mm-hmm. So,
but do you think that the omega-6 consumption is the primary driver of this massive surge in cancers in Western countries, or no? Can we say that, or is that too suspicious?
I think that I think that you can say that. Cancer, Otto Warburg, who came up with the metabolic theory of cancer, was working in Germany before and during World War II. Hitler was terrified of cancer, and apparently there was a huge epidemic of cancer going on in Germany. The Germans invented the process of hydrogenating vegetable oils to replace animal fats. And one of the things apparently that the Germans were interested in Russia was the sunflower fields as a fat source. So, looking at, I think I may have mentioned this last time around, there's a anti-cancer gene called P53, which is preferentially mutated by HNE as a result of seed oil consumption. And this is seen in bowel cancer and liver cancer. That could be the explanation for why we've seen cancer rates go up so much since the, 1800s, call it, when seed oils were first introduced. But, and also why traditional societies, like traditional Africa, they had very little cancer. They did have one kind of cancer that was shown to be caused by the Epstein-Barr virus. And for instance, Eskimos also are susceptible to that same cancer because of this viral infection. So, there are cancers that can be caused by viruses even if you're on a carnivore Eskimo diet.
Could they thrive as well once they hit a body like that, if it's a viral cancer?
Well, it would kill them. So, and it's a rather nasty cancer that tends to happen around the mouth and the lymph nodes here. So, Burkitt's lymphoma, it's a rather unpleasant disease.
Dr. Lasanti is a cancer researcher I've interviewed a few times. He's over in Salford University, and he's an American teacher over in England. And he's one of the most cited scholars on Google Scholar, dead or alive. He's got tens of thousands of citations. But he was saying that about a woman who got a cancer in the eye, I believe, from her bird. It was like transmitted through a virus, and then they treated it using azithromycin and doxycycline, and it was very successful. I think maybe it was a bacteria, I guess. But I mean, they have antiviral effects with those antibiotics too. But that was interesting just to make that observation about the viral and bacterial connection there with some cancers, you know?
Yeah. And, further to the cancer thing, there's a paper, boy, this is really stretching my brain. But anyway, there's a marker for genetic damage. And there's a paper that shows that the primary cause of this genetic damage is omega-6 breakdown products like HNE. They were specifically looking at HNE. So, and this is the most common genetic damage that's seen in cancers. So it's not a stretch to say that omega-6 fats are the leading cause of DNA damage. And one of the big questions in cancer is, why do you have tens of thousands of mutations in cancer cells? And why are cancer, that's an open question. So, I certainly think that's the case, just based on that evidence. And particularly, in Japan, they had what they called the Western cancers, which were the ones that went up dramatically after World War II when the American diet was introduced into Japan. And one of the things that the Americans did with a great deal of vim and vigor was try and encourage the Japanese to eat lots of seed oils. And there's a paper from the 90s looking at, what they called excess linoleic acid and omega-3 deficiency diseases in Japan. And they blame it all on, that's what they blame it on, is too much seed oils from the Americans and not enough omega-3 from moving away from the traditional Japanese diet. And they point their finger to heart disease and obesity and, what they call the Western cancers. So certainly, I think for certain types of cancers, there's a really strong argument, and that would include things like breast cancer. There's a really strong argument to be made for
which happen to be the cancers that are spiking the most, is what we're saying, right? That's what we're talking about.
Yeah, that's exactly. That's
go back
exactly
to the cancer epidemic. It's not like people haven't been getting cancer for thousands of years, but the point of why we're seeing Nixon declares war on cancer in 1960, and then the omega-6 linoleic acid seed oils just give cancer the victory for decades.
So why was Nixon declaring war on cancer and George Washington wasn't? Well, cancer wasn't a big problem when George Washington was president, and neither was heart disease or diabetes or obesity or, poor George had a major problem with his teeth rotting out because of a high sugar diet. So don't do that.
See, I want to push. I've heard a doctor, and I'm sorry, I don't remember the name because he's been on my show, but he said that there's a connection between tooth decay and the bacteria that's found on the arterial disease of heart disease with the plaque. And he said and he was making a connection between why you need to avoid sugar for that reason, because it's like the same bacteria that it's like you find it in tooth decay. It's also found in that arterial disease. Have you heard of that?
Yeah, I've heard of that. And that's pretty straightforward, right? You're to a certain extent, that's pretty straightforward. So obviously your mouth is the place that's most exposed to bacteria in your body because you're stuffing stuff in there, and obviously if you have tooth decay and gingivitis, if your gums are bleeding, that means you've got holes in your blood vessels in your mouth, and that's like opening the door to whatever bacteria are in your mouth to go into the rest of your body. So that's pretty straightforward. Again, back. So let's look for the black swan in this hypothesis. Well, the Hadza have pretty crappy teeth, as it turns out, but they don't have any heart disease and they don't wash their hands, and they stuff dirt in their mouth, but they don't have heart disease. So I think it's a bit of a stretch I think that's an association without causation. Okay. That said, this is one of my favorite comments on Twitter, where one has to be concise and hopefully witty. When people say, "Oh, well, you don't have any evidence that a high carb diet rots is unhealthy," and I say, "Yeah, it does. It rots your face." How can you call any diet that rots your face a healthy diet? That's just like basic, right? And that's Weston Price's whole point. He went around the world and he looked at all these people and he was like, "Oh, look, they have a healthy diet. They don't have any tooth decay or cavities or a tiny rate of cavities," right?
And for most people, because they've been eating tons of PUFA, it's when you're eating lots of carbs and sugar, it's inhibiting your ability to clean out the PUFA out of your body, right?
It's inhibiting it, and it's also exacerbating its effects, right? And I mean, there is some evidence that a high omega-6 diet is going to be bad for your dental health. I mean, personally, excuse me, I had a long history of bad dental health. And I got off sugar when I was in my late teens because of this. And God bless that dentist, because I didn't have another cavity for, I've had one tiny little cavity since I was 18 years old, and I'm 53 now, after having a mouthful of cavities when I was a kid. But one of the interesting things that I found was that my gingivitis was getting worse. Every time I brushed my teeth, I would have a lot of bleeding, and my teeth were loose. And what happened when I fixed my diet and dropped the seed oils is that my teeth got firm again, and I stopped getting bleeding. And I've looked into that literature, and there's some clear evidence that oxidative, back to what they're calling oxidative stress, which we know is omega-6 toxicity, effectively, is highly associated and probably causal in a lot of dental issues, which would explain why when Dr. Price went around the world, the high carb people that he looked at had in some cases, a 1 or 2% cavity rate versus his patients here in the United States who had super high cavity rates. So maybe, it seems to be a further accelerant. And it's also something where mechanistically, it breaks down your connective tissue. So, my experience that my teeth were loose before I fixed my diet shouldn't be all that surprising, because I was eating something that is well demonstrated in the literature to break down your connective tissue.
That's right. Omega-6 or the sugar, just to clarify.
Omega-6.
Okay. Yeah, and it makes sense that if people are eating high carbs in an ancestral context, but they're maybe eating nose to tail, so they're getting all their minerals they need, right? That's very important too, right?
They're getting the healthy fats that are found in animal fat sources, right? Whether it's fish or pastured animals, wild animals. There's a really interesting, and that's really a somewhat unexplored area. There was a fascinating study with cheetahs, of all things, and they were comparing, apparently, when you take a cheetah out of the wild, out of its natural environment, you put it into a zoo and you start feeding it, it's a carnivore. It's still, you got to feed it animals, right? But the cheetahs in the zoos were getting all these strange diseases that the wild cheetahs never got. And they finally figured out that it seemed to be because of these trace fatty acids. They were getting too much N6 in their diet because they were being fed animals that were raised on farms and fed grains, and they weren't getting the natural fats that they would be getting if they were out eating wild animals. So probably not, that may be a big part of this seed oil story here in, the industrialized world, is that we're not getting these fats that we are expected to get. And, this has been shown in humans that if you're not getting some of these odd chain, they call them fatty acids, 15 or 17 carbon atoms in the fat chain, that lower amounts of that in the blood predisposes you to diabetes, and higher amounts in the blood is protective for diabetes. And you get those from, ruminants, cows, and dairy. Which could explain why they're now figuring out, after demonizing saturated fat for decades, that, people who eat more dairy, more full fat dairy, have lower rates of heart disease. So, that's
very interesting. And you've made a compelling case about some of the fundamentals about ketosis and ketogenic living. And you've made a great case for, parsing out the important differences between what omega-6 consumption and seed oils are doing to us versus what the sugar's doing. And then, of course, we're just touched the surface with all this stuff. But I want to kind of land the plane now by addressing the Ray Peat frame, and what obviously there's a lot there. You've said he's a genius, and I've heard stuff from folks that are nutritionists that are listening to that frame of thinking. And I've heard just from my layman's perspective, a few things that stood out to me was, long-term ketosis, is linked with that cortisol, which is not good, having your body stressed out all the time. And then I've heard about the idea of being, a low metabolism, versus having a high metabolism when you eat these good, fruits and orange juice and things like that, that the Ray Peat principles try to point towards. Of course, your argument about omega-6 is shared by that crowd, but what's the kind of steel man their argument briefly, and then kind of what your response is to their criticism of long-term ketosis as you've understood it?
Well, I got introduced to Ray Peat 10 plus years ago, probably through Stefan Guillenet, who I mentioned before. And Guillenet's, it's hard to know what to make of Ray Peat. His articles are incredibly dense, but Stefan's comment on him was that Ray Peat's references always say what he says they say. And you wouldn't think that's anything, but I mean, I can take, I can pull out a presidential advisory put out by the AHA a couple of years ago talking about how there's no evidence for harm from omega-6 fats, and do exactly that, go through and show you how they just flat out lied about what some of their references said to make their argument. So not misrepresenting your sources is a common problem in scientific literature. So the fact that Ray actually, and I've done this exercise with his stuff, he'll make this ridiculous sounding claim, and you go through and read the paper, and sure enough, it says exactly what he says it says. So he's largely, if you had to put him in a bucket, he's basically a paleo diet guy. So he advises against eating processed starches, lots of starch, high amounts of glucose. He advises against eating seeds for the same reason the paleo people do, that, they tend to contain a lot of plant toxins and a lot of PUFAs. And I will say, to steelman his argument, I think that largely it's what he's advocating is a healthy diet and a beneficial diet. I don't think it's a magic bullet for longevity. And I don't know that there is a magic bullet for longevity. But, in preparation for this, I went and listened to a really neat 1.5 hour long interview with him on YouTube, and he's in his 80s, and, he seems like he's in his 80s. He doesn't look like he's, a 30-year-old guy who's in his 80s. Sharp, thin, healthy looking, but, not like, wow, I want to do whatever he's doing. So the two really controversial things that he says that get people all spun up are, he points out the toxicity of omega-3 fats, which most people think are healthy. Those are the, fats that we find in fish oil and in fish, and in small amounts in ruminant fat. And he promotes health benefits of sugar consumption, which really wigs people out because, sugar's the great, thanks to Gary Taubes largely, sugar's the great demon of the diet world nowadays. So omega-3 fats, like omega-6 fats, are very fragile. We all know how fast a fish goes rancid. That's the process of their omega-3 fats breaking down. In fact, the signature smell of rancid omega-3 fats is the human brain interprets it as a rotten fish, which is why you don't see potatoes fried in fish oil.
I just had some ground beef the other day, and I smelled it. I said, "This smells like fish. It's nasty," and we didn't eat it.
Was it pastured or grass-fed?
No, it was just regular beef, but it was just it sat in the fridge too long.
Yeah. So that's the omega-3 fats breaking down. What's interesting is omega-6 fats breaking down don't smell unpleasant to people, which is why they use, which is one of the advantages of using them in stored foods, that you don't gag at it. So, it's absolutely true. They recommend against, the scientific literature looks at the harms of eating oxidized fats in fish oil capsules. And that's a whole big deal, because Omega-3 fats also break down into toxic compounds. They're much less toxic, importantly, than omega-6 fat breakdown products are, but they're not without harm, which is probably why we evolved not to like to eat them. He may go, he advises that you take aspirin as you get older to protect you from the inevitable amount of polyunsaturated fatty acids that are in your diet. I think that's going a little too far for my book. One of the things that what aspirin does is prevent omega-6 or PUFAs, polyunsaturated fatty acids from being converted into these pro-inflammatory molecules in the body. So that's the benefit of aspirin. So that's why he recommends that you take an aspirin pill every day. He does mention, I tried that for a little while right after they thought I had a stroke, and it made me miserable. So that was the end of that experiment. So yeah, definitely, the flip side of that is some of the healthiest populations on earth are the ones that eat a lot of fish, right? And there's a difference between the fats you get in a fish oil pill and the fats you get in a fish, right? They come in packaged in slightly different forms. And the form that you get in a fish is more easily absorbed and seems to be more beneficial to the body than the ones from fish oil. So I don't know. He recommends eating fish. He recommends avoiding fatty fish like salmon, or I presume mackerel and sardines, and eating things like, cod, which I also love, and whitefish, which tend to be less fatty. So that's within the range of a normal human diet, as far as I'm concerned. As far as his sugar thing goes, one needs to remember human evolutionary history. We evolved from primates, from frugivores, right? So there was a period, a chimpanzee, our closest genetic relative, eats a lot of fruit, right? And most humans eat as much fruit as they can get their hands on. And if you go to Africa, they have these huge sweet fruits that humans would eat, and every other creature that could get their hands on. So sugar in the human diet goes back, way before meat eating as a large source of our calories went back. Everything that I've seen about the negative effects of sugar in the human diet is from wildly excess amounts of sugar, right? Refining sugar out of sugar beets, or what is the normal sugar cane, is probably a bad idea. That's going to give you way too much sugar. But if you're getting your sugar from whole fruit, as Pete would recommend you get it, or from orange juice, probably a bit more, but I think that's, again, a perfectly reasonable suggestion. And there's no evidence, whatsoever that the sugar you get from fruit is harmful. And it's
what about the amounts of fruit sugar, because of modern hybridization of fruit, they've extremely more sweet than they were right in the wild when our DNA.
Yeah, that claim's not accurate.
That's not true.
The fruits you find in Africa are, 20-pound fruits that are super sweet. They would eat a lot of, or honey. There are a number of different tribes in Africa who eat enormous amounts of honey, which is as close as you're going to get to a refined sugar source. I mean, it is effectively a refined sugar source refined by the bees. I mean, the Hadza, honey and meat are their two favorite food sources. And, there's another tribe in Africa that seasonally eats up to 80% of their calories from honey, right? And they don't have any of the chronic diseases. And the Hadza at this point are probably the best studied group of people on earth from a healthy diet perspective. And they have dental problems, but they don't have obesity. They don't have, anything else. So, wow. You gotta, now I will say that in the context of a high N6 diet, sugar becomes much more harmful. Fructose is excess fructose is processed in the liver and appears to really mess up the N6 fats that are in your liver. There's a study looking at the effect of fructose on human kids, and it was that to oxidize the N6 fats in their body, which resulted in their ox-LDL levels going up. And ox-LDL is probably one of the main vehicles to cardiovascular disease in humans. So, that's clear evidence of how excess sugar can be bad. But in natural human diets, there's just, again, it will rot your face, it will rot your teeth. So too much of it's probably not a great thing. But, it's not, I don't think there's any evidence out there that it's the root cause of all these chronic diseases. It can certainly exacerbate them. And, sugar
like you
certainly.
said, with kids with the omega-6, they had heart disease, right? Or something, or what was that?
Well, oxidized LDL, which is an important step on the pathway to heart disease. Yes, that's right. So personally, I mean, I was shocked when I read, being on a very low sugar diet for a long time. I was shocked when I read Weston Price, and his tooth decay reversal diet included a lot more sugar than I was letting myself eat. And that kind of made me think, okay, well, maybe what I'm doing here isn't really necessary. And so I kind of reintroduced a bit more sugar into my diet to no ill effect that, as far as my dental health goes. As long as I stayed away from the candy jar at the office, which is how I got my one cavity in the last 30 odd years.
Yeah.
But again, that's a refined sugar source. So I think, some of the things that he's, the aspirin to deal with PUFA as you're getting older, I think goes a little too far. I don't agree with the extremity of his position on omega-3 fats. I think that, there's some clear evidence that is probably required in human diets to some extent. That doesn't mean you need to go chugging fish oil every day, which he would recommend against, and I would recommend against too. But, and I also don't, he recommends shellfish because they're super nutritious, eating some liver. I mean, there are some areas where I think Ray Peat may go a little far. And I think then they're the Ray Peat followers, and as is often the case, they can misinterpret stuff and can get a little gung-ho. I mean, I don't think that eating sugar is the key to longevity either. And I don't think that you need to go out of your way to eat sugar. Sugar, most of the sugar that if you're eating an evolutionary amount of sugar, most of it's going to turn into glucose and a little bit of fructose that will probably get turned into saturated fat in your liver. Well, okay, there are other ways to get both of those things. Your body's going to make enough glucose. And if you eat a little, if you have a potato or some rice once in a while, it's not going to kill you. And it'll give your body whatever beneficial effects that Pete argues we might get from glucose consumption. One of his arguments is that, it prevents higher cortisol levels. What cortisol is a hormone. The synthetic version of it is prednisone. And it does a couple of things. It turns down your immune system, which is useful in short doses. And it tells your body to break down muscle for fuel, which is, again, helpful in short doses. So, if you're on a diet that's promoting a high background cortisol level, it's conceivable. And especially, I mean, personally, one of the things that I've found the nicest about this way of eating is that I maintain my muscle volume with much less effort than I used to, right? It used to be
eating keto or
well, I mean, I'm kind of intermittent keto, paleo, whatever you want to call it. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, a paleo diet is an intermittent keto diet.
Even with a lot of fruit?
Even with a lot of fruit.
Really?
Well, I mean, it depends. Are you eating fruit all day? Do you have an orange once a day or a couple times a day? Then that's fine. Certainly I'll tell you, if I go out into the woods and I find a raspberry bush, I'm going to eat every darn raspberry on that bush until I can't eat another thing, and they're delicious.
Yeah.
But that only happens a couple of times a year, right? And that's more of an evolutionary appropriate level of fruit consumption.
Sure, yeah. I'm just thinking about, like, with kids, a lot of kids are fed tons of fruit. And I wonder, is that healthy for kids or not? I don't know.
Well, so, Pete So human kids are obviously a great case study for human beings in general. And if you look at breast milk has a lot of saturated fat in it. It has some PUFA in it. It has some omega-6 PUFA, very dependent on the diet. And it has some omega-3 PUFA, also dependent on the diet. There's a great study comparing the Chimane Indians in Bolivia to American breast milk. And American breast milk has a lot less omega-3 and a lot more omega-6 because of our diet. So I would say you want, they don't get heart disease. So you want to do what they're doing, which is, eating wild animals and a lot of starch and, whatever fruits and vegetables they can get in the jungle down there. And now they're starting to eat seed oils and they're starting to get obese. So don't do that, right? Human model, perfect. So, human breast milk has saturated fats in it. It has monounsaturated fats. It has lactose, which your body turns into short chain fatty acids through fermentation in the stomach, and also directly absorbs as glucose. So, all these things are part of a normal human diet. And,
I wonder if the body prevents PUFA, because a woman, even if they're eating healthy, they may have had decades of PUFA when they get pregnant and breastfeeding. And I wonder if the body preferentially biases those PUFAs in her body being used into the milk because they want to keep the baby healthy. And if it burns PUFA first in your own fuel, because like you're saying, perhaps it's like ethanol, they're trying to get rid of the waste product rather than store it. Maybe the body would have the intelligence to know if someone's had decades of PUFA, don't put that fat into the body, to the baby through breast milk.
That doesn't seem
that's not what happens.
That doesn't, it may happen to some degree, but it doesn't, as I said, the American breast milk was higher in N6 PUFA by quite a lot than the Bolivian breast milk. I haven't seen a dietary breakdown of, garbage in to garbage out, as it were, right? Which would be a really interesting thing to look at. Also really interesting to see, how fast can you change the levels in your breast milk if you change the levels in your diet?
Right. That's kind of what I'm getting at.
Right.
I'm just thinking out loud here. Like, obviously, if the standard American diet is eating, if the person's eating lots of omega-6 fat, seed oils all the time, I could see how that would be very high in the breast milk. But if they've stopped it for some time, but they've had decades of accumulation in their body, with the
what's
body
the effect?
biases.
Yeah. No, I've never seen anything like that. That would, that's, if they took human nutrition seriously, they'd be doing stuff like that. Because I'm not the only person who's pointing out that, high levels of N6 in human food fed to babies is a bad idea. And it's not a new idea. There's a great paper from the 70s looking at rodents with this very dry, unbelievably black, morbid comment. Rats are protected from high levels of omega-6 in the diet to some effect because of the negative effect it has on their reproduction.
Oh, wow.
Oops. That was the 1970s. So we're doing this to human children. That's not a good idea.
Yeah, we're having declining birth rates too as omega-6 consumption continues, right? Yeah.
And there's a whole number of avenues why that may be happening. But there's one really interesting thing. There's a fat called mead acid, which is an omega-9 fat, right? Just to throw in another number, omega-9 fats are made by the body. So oleic acid in olive oil is an omega-9 fat, and it's sort of the preferred fat in the human body because it's what we, like stearic acid is turned into oleic acid in the body, and palmitic acid is turned into palmitoleic, which is another omega-9, if I'm remembering correctly, fatty acid in the body. But so there's this mead acid, which is made from oleic acid in the body, right? Now, I have this hypothesis that a woman's body, when it's producing a child, is prioritizing creating as perfect an offspring as it can, right? And women will wind up deficient in various different nutrients if they have a baby, because the body ships those off to the baby so that you can have the healthiest baby possible, right? So you're trying to make a perfect little organism to come out. And then, once it hits life, everything goes all awry. And I think from an evolutionary perspective, that makes a heck of a lot of sense. And it explains why, women crave these weird foods, and also why they can wind up being deficient in all these nutrients after pregnancy. So what does that have to do with omega-6 fats? So the definition of omega-6 fat deficiency in an animal is production of this mead acid. Okay. That's literally, if they see mead acid in your blood in any large amount, they say, oh, you're deficient in omega-6 fats. Please go chug a can of corn oil. But what's fascinating is that in every species they've looked at, cartilage is made from mead acid preferentially, right? And when a human baby or any other species of animal is born, their cartilage is made from this mead acid, which is very protected from oxidation, as we've discussed. And then it rapidly, upon exposure to omega-6 fats, gets replaced by the omega-6 fats. So it's been demonstrated, for a long time, it was thought that short chain omega-6 fats, linoleic acid specifically, were essential fats, that you had to consume them. And it's now been demonstrated that that's not the case, that they're not essential. Maybe in some tiny trace amount, we need them.
What's not essential?
Linoleic acid.
Okay.
Is not essential. And what I've begun to think is maybe what's supposed to happen is that you're supposed to be making this mead acid and not be using linoleic acid. Because what you see in osteoarthritis and osteoporosis is the disease process is these omega-6 fats breaking down into these toxins that then break down the cartilage. And, HNE, this toxin that I keep going back to, is recognized as the cause of fibrosis, which we see in all these different diseases. You see it in heart disease. And, it's basically healthy cartilage is being turned into this fibrotic mess that is non-elastic and more susceptible to damage. And it's probably why we've seen this explosion of cartilage disease and damage in humans. Like, the perfect poster child is the ACL tear, which was in the 60s rare. It wasn't even described in the medical literature until the 1960s as something that, it was described in the football team at West Point. And now kids are getting it. So it went from a rare injury in the 1960s to something that huge numbers of children are getting all over the country now. What changed? Well, one of the things that could have changed is the fats that cartilage is in part made from has changed from a stable fat to a fat that easily gets damaged. And that's why, in the
how do we make omega-9 meat acid again, right?
You go on what a dietitian would tell you is an omega-6 deficient diet, and you get your PUFAs from eating fish and pastured meats, which is what we evolved to do, basically.
So you're saying to eat those things to get the omega-9 up, or to not eat those? I'm sorry.
You want to avoid eating omega-6 fats.
Okay. So avoid the chicken and the fish and the pork and all the seed oils.
And the farmed fish, yeah. And
the cows, can you eat conventional beef and be okay with getting omega-9 up? I know I just opened probably another can of cow beef. But.
Well, cows are protected to some extent against omega-6 consumption because of the bacteria in their, four stomachs. But, if you're eating conventional beef, eat some fish along with it. I would say if you're eating nothing but pastured beef and meats, and wild animals, you probably don't need to worry about any fish. That's where most humans evolved.
Tucker,
fish wasn't a major part of our diet.
As always, this is fascinating stuff, and I'm left with more questions than answers, even though you've provided a lot of answers. But we've been in a lot of different places with the discussion. I think it's been fun for all of us, and thank you for your time. And, I got to get this answer because I'm not good at doing cliffhangers. Okay. I like information. So just to go back, you don't see a problem with the argument about the high cortisol for long-term keto, that the some of the folks make?
I've never seen any evidence of damage from a long-term ketogenic diet, and it's probably the most studied diet used therapeutically. Not probably, it is. I mean, you have to remember the Atkins diet starts as a ketogenic diet,
Right.
and the Atkins diet book is one of the best-selling books in history. So countless millions of people were on the Atkins diet. There are a bunch of medical diets like Medifast and OptiFast. Those are ketogenic diets. Those are public companies. You know, millions more people have been on those diets. And if you actually try and look for evidence of harm from anything other than a medical ketogenic diet used to treat epilepsy, you find a handful of cases. So I would not stop. You know, if you're getting a real benefit from a ketogenic diet, I would not stop it because you're worried about your cortisol levels.
And can you have a high metabolism on long-term ketosis? Because I've heard they say that you're always going to have a slow metabolism.
Well,
with a ketosis.
I was out 2 nights ago sleeping on the side of a mountain on the snow, melting the snow underneath me. So I have no problems with my metabolism. I'm a furnace.
Yeah, very good. Well, hey, it's a pleasure talking to you as always. I want folks to go to your blog, yelling-stop.blogspot.com, yelling-stop.blogspot.com.
And I'm really active on Twitter.
Yeah. What's your at Tucker Goodrich? Is that right?
At Tucker Goodrich. I try and keep it simple. David, it's been great. Thank you so much for having me on.
Take care.